Hello and welcome to First Look, a Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. This week we're looking at the readings for the fourth and final Sunday of Advent, and thus looking at a famous prophecy of Micah, which relates to Jesus' birth in Bethlehem, and to a really powerful interaction between two women, Mary and Elizabeth, in which we get a real glimpse into the justice and vision that Jesus would bring as he matured. But before we dive into any of this, however, if you've not done so already, you might find it useful to download the sheet that accompanies this study, the link for which is in the video description in YouTube. On the sheet, you will find the text of both of our readings for today, some other passages you may find it helpful to look up, the questions we'll be considering later on, and lots of space for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado, let's dive into this week's passage from the Hebrew Scriptures, which comes from the prophet Micah, chapter 5, verses 2 to 5a. We know that Micah lived in very turbulent times, that Israel in the north and Judah in the south were threatened by the dominant power in the region, the Assyrians. And in that context, neither small nation stood a chance of facing their powerful neighbour down militarily. And so the overarching theme of Micah is about faithfulness to Yahweh, as really the only hope of coming through that situation. Micah rails against social and moral abuse in the land. In earlier chapters, we hear that the poorest had been deprived of their lands and inheritances, that widows were being evicted from their homes, that weights and measures were being fixed in order to cheat customers, and that bribery was normal, and so forth. So that takes us to chapter 2 verses 1 to 9, chapter 6 verses 10 and 11, and chapter 7 verse 3. And we learn furthermore in chapter 6 verse 16 that worship of Baal, worship of the foreign god, was being tolerated, which also incurred divine wrath. Micah rails against all of this and against self-serving prophets and religious authorities, whom he saw as bringing about Jerusalem's ruin. We see in chapter 3 verses 5 to 6. And yet out of all of that devastation, Micah also brings a profound vision of peace, as we see in chapter 4 verse 3, with the famous fig tree imagery, in which all will have their own fig tree and all will be satisfied. Perhaps the key figure in this particular passage is David, who was the greatest king of Israel, and there are various allusions that are made to him throughout this passage, and I'll say more about that later on. We know that Micah was a prophet around the 8th century before the Common Era, in which many people from Israel had been carted off to exile in Egypt following the capture of Samaria in the year 722 BCE. And we know that Micah's ministry spanned quite a period. He was active in the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and King Zedekiah, so covering a period from 759 through to 687 BCE. And what we have here is very much a prophetic oracle promising restoration. Now, there are some other texts that it's useful for us to keep in mind if we're going to make sense of what we find here in Micah. So one of those comes from 2 Kings, chapters 18 and 19, and that documents attacks on various towns in Judah, which forms some of the backdrop to Micah's ministry. We might step back a little bit into Micah chapter 4, verses 8 to 10. We find a related text that begins with "and you," so in the same way that today's passage begins, And there are various similarities between the two little sections of Micah. And finally, we want to take a look at Matthew chapter 2, and specifically verses 5 and 6, because this little bit of Matthew references our passage from Micah in order to claim that Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And when we start to look at the content of the passage, the first thing we might notice is that the lectionary misses out verse 1 of this chapter, in which we're told that the people of Judah found themselves under siege and in great distress. And it's an interesting omission, because actually it's that proclamation that gives the backdrop to everything that Micah is now about to say. Chapter 5 of this book contains the first promise of restoration in the whole work, focused on regaining the land which was so vital for survival and for identity, and indeed for maintaining hope in the future. And as I hinted at earlier, there are multiple allusions to King David at work in this text. So we have reference to Bethlehem in the first part of verse 2. Bethlehem is David's birthplace. As is connected with at the end of verse 2 and also in verse 4, we're reminded that David was the most prominent and significant past ruler of Israel, who shaped so much of their imagination. By the time of Micah, as the end of verse 2 hints, his reign was indeed of old. And picking up on what we find in verse 4, we know that David was a shepherd, as the coming ruler would also be. So there's lots of sort of very clear connections we can make. But perhaps most importantly of all is the fact that if we look at the story of the calling of David in 1 Samuel 16, he's an example of a younger brother that God favoured over and above several older brothers. And that's true despite the requirement in Deuteronomy 21 verses 15 to 17 that the oldest brother should always be the one who inherits the birthright, whatever their father's feelings on the subject happen to be. So David is really profoundly shaping this vision in more ways than one. Now Bethlehem is described as one of the little clans of Judah at the beginning of verse 2. And the Hebrew term that's translated little could also be translated as least or significant. So in other words, in verse 2, we've got another example of the least significant, as it were, being exalted by God. And note that that was also said of Jesus of Nazareth in John chapter 1 verse 46, when it talks about Nazareth as a place, and the line is, well, what good's ever come out of Nazareth? For all these allusions to David, however, this is a deeply mysterious text. It's unclear who or what specifically is being referenced a lot of the time, especially in verse 3. So when it refers to a he and a them, we don't know who that is. We don't know what it means to give them. There's no up in the Hebrew, it's give them, not give them up. And we don't know who the woman in labour is, and we don't know who are the kindred of the he in this passage. One way we might begin to clarify things a little bit, possibly, is to bear in mind, as I said, there are connections between chapter 4 verses 8 to 10 and chapter 5 verses 2 to 5. So both of these passages begin with the words and you. Both are addressed to cities, Jerusalem in the first instance, Bethlehem in the second, and both speak of a woman in labour. Now in chapter 4 verses 9 and 10, that woman in labour, we're told, represents Zion. Her labour pains represent the trials of exile, and her deliverance is promised by God. And it could be that there are connections here between that song and the woman in the first part of verse 3 of today's reading, with the kindred being exiled Israelites. We don't know that that's necessarily how to correctly interpret it, but it's perhaps one approach that we could use. While scholars do disagree on what we should make of this passage, there is agreement that what it does is it points to a new David, a messianic hope. We're looking therefore to a figure who would gather all of the people of Israel together to place themselves under the rule of the Lord, and thus to be led into safety and peace. And as such, both Jewish and Christian interpreters have seen it as messianic. If we jump forward a little bit to chapter 6 of Micah, verses 6 to 8, we come to a really famous summary about doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly. And it points to the overarching direction that God's people would be led in. And bearing in mind, Micah has focused a lot on social and moral failure. This passage is significant for interpreting anything we find subsequently, I think. And we need to keep this in mind as well as we turn to our New Testament passage. So let us now dive into that passage from Luke's Gospel, chapter 1, verses 39 through to 55. We know that Elizabeth and Zechariah had been unable to have children and were getting somewhat older. But the angel Gabriel appeared to Zechariah, telling him that he would be a father. And we're told Zechariah was sceptical about this. He didn't believe it was possible. And thus God rendered him mute until the baby, John, was born. And following this incident, Elizabeth did indeed fall pregnant, and we're told spent a period of 5 months in seclusion. So that's what we find in chapter 1, verses 5 through to 25. And then following that, in verses 26 through to 38, we're told that around a month later, Mary was also visited by the angel Gabriel, and she was told that she would conceive and become the mother of the Son of God by the power of the Holy Spirit, despite being a virgin. And that passage ends with Mary's incredibly courageous yes to God, agreeing to take on that responsibility despite the risks, in a culture where having a baby outside of wedlock could have led to her being stoned to death. It's likely also that Mary was only around 12 years old, because that was the typical age at which Jewish girls were betrothed, and you'd have a year-long period of betrothal before finally becoming married. And we know that she was engaged to Joseph, but he doesn't yet feature in this section. We only learn about him in chapter 2, verse 5. So who do we have here? Well, most obviously we have Elizabeth, who was an older relative of Mary and pregnant with the baby who would become John the Baptist. And we have Mary, who was from Nazareth, which was really just a backwater in Galilee. And she visited her older cousin, we're told, for a period of 3 months. We learn that in verse 56. Now, Luke's Gospel was the third to be written around 80 to 85 of the Common Era. And as well as it being predominantly to a Gentile audience and part of a 2-volume work with Acts, it's also the Gospel that places the greatest emphasis on the stories of marginalised people, and in particular on the stories of women. We only really have 2 Gospels that focus on the events surrounding the birth of Jesus, Matthew and Luke. And it's interesting that Matthew's account is focused primarily on Joseph, it's his perspective, whereas for Luke it's very definitely about the women. It's about Mary and Elizabeth, and later on the prophet Anna. And what we have here is a kind of reading of 2 parts. We've got a bit that's gospel narrative and a bit that's one of the songs that permeate the opening chapters of Luke's Gospel, placed onto the lips of Mary. Now, if we want to fully grasp the significance of the events narrated here, it's helpful to look at Genesis, chapters 17 through to 21, and the story of Sarah, who conceived a child in her old age after decades of not being able to do so. So she was someone in a very similar situation to Elizabeth. And it's also worth keeping in mind 1 Samuel, beginning at chapter 1 verse 1 and going through to chapter 2 verse 10, In that chapter, Hannah is a woman who is also unable to conceive, and she cries out to God, and God hears her cries, and she eventually gives birth to a baby called Samuel, who she dedicates to God and to Israel. And in particular, verses 1 to 10 of chapter 2 form what's become known as the Song of Hannah, and there are significant connections, as we'll see, between Mary's song, the Magnificat, and Hannah's song. So we're told in verses 39 to 40 that Elizabeth and Zechariah were living in a town up in the hill country of Judea, an unspecified town, to which Mary headed with haste from her home in Galilee after her encounter with the angel Gabriel, and she's greeted there by her older cousin. It doesn't seem that Zechariah's at home at this point. Maybe he was fulfilling priestly duties. When Elizabeth heard this greeting, we're told that the baby in her womb leapt. And we hear that not just at the beginning of verse 41, but also in verse 44, leaping for joy at the sight of Mary. And that might seem quite ironic given Zechariah's scepticism about God's promises. And it shows also that Jesus was indeed greater than his older cousin, John the Baptist. And that's a theme that's echoed in chapter 3, verses 1 to 6, and then 15 through to 18. And indeed throughout the various of the other Gospels, where John the Baptist talks about being unworthy to tie the sandals of the one who will come after him. Elizabeth seems to very clearly recognise God's salvation being made possible by Mary's, say, remarkable yes. And we're told in verse 41 at the end of it that she was filled with the Holy Spirit, just as verse 15 has told us that her unborn baby was. And this leads in verse 42 to her exclamation with a loud voice, as it puts it. If we look at the Greek, it's loud as in sort of using a megaphone. It's a really kind of powerful outburst of prophetic proclamation. And there's a clear echo of this magnifying, of this making mega, as it were, in verse 46 at the beginning of the Magnificat. Elizabeth proclaims, as we read on in verse 42, what would not yet be obvious to the naked eye, that Mary was pregnant. And Elizabeth says that her unborn child would be blessed by God. Now, the use of blessed in this passage is quite interesting. In this instance, at the end of verse 42, the term used is eulogmeny, and that means a blessing that begins in the present and carries on in the future. So what it's essentially putting forward is a vision of both present and future praise. And the recognition in verse 43 by Elizabeth of Mary as the mother of the Lord shows that Elizabeth had really understood the significance of Jesus. And in that sense, she was one of the first to proclaim something of the good news. Now in verse 45, we have a slightly different term that's used for blessing, Makaria. And that's the same term that Jesus uses in the Beatitudes in Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. And it's a term that's used to say that Mary's faith in God is going to be praised. Her acceptance of God's promises will be praised. In that sense, she is blessed. And it shows Mary being embraced by her older cousin Elizabeth, despite her what may have seemed outrageous claim about having conceived the child within her womb by the Holy Spirit. And there's yet another implicit contrast here with Zechariah's scepticism about the promises of God. Mary's response to Elizabeth's proclamation is the Magnificat, the Song of Mary. And it's a really powerful song. It contains lots of gospel reversals in which the last are first and the first are last. And it utilises poetry and song to point anew to the extraordinary and unexpected goodness of God. Now note that throughout the Magnificat, the terms that are used to describe what God's been doing are past tenses. It points to God, therefore, as the one who has always been on the side of the oppressed and marginalised people. And it recalls the keeping of God's promises that began with Abraham, flowed through the liberation narrative of Exodus, and reached their peak with Jesus Christ. Now, as I mentioned earlier, there are clear parallels between the Song of Hannah in 1 Samuel 2 verses 1 to 10 and the Magnificat here in verses 46 to 55. And it's instructive to bring them alongside one another and to view them together. We note that both Hannah and Mary express joy in their God. They recognise that God lifts up the lowly, and they're aware that God is acting for all people through what God is doing for them specifically. And it's important to note the historical backdrop to all of this was Israel's oppression by the occupying Roman forces. And that means when the Magnificat talks about things about the mighty being put down from their seat and the lowly being lifted up, to use one translation of it, it's making political statements. And we need also to note that in the year 4 BCE, which some estimate is roughly when Jesus was born, to do with complexities of dating systems, there was a mass rebellion against Roman rule, which was really brutally crushed. And Elizabeth and Zechariah and indeed Mary would have been perhaps able to remember those events. They'd have been aware of that sort of thing going on. And thus the Magnificat sums up really how Jesus is the one through whom God is going to bring that longed for liberation at last to the people of Israel. Albeit, as we'll see when we read on in the Gospel, perhaps not quite in the way that some people hope for.